Hello, folks. Welcome back. This is Mark Divine with the Unbeatable Mind podcast. Super stoked to have you here today. I very much appreciate your time and attention. And I thank you for that. And I thank you for all of you who have rated the podcast. And if you haven't, it's very helpful when you rate the podcast, especially on iTunes or Amazon, because other like-minded people can find the podcast that way. So thank you for that. A couple quick announcements. Welcome my new podcast producer, Jason Sanderson. Jason lives over in Prague, of all places, but he's a British citizen. And he runs, or he does the audio production for a couple other really high profile podcasts. So you'll be noticing some changes starting with this episode, and we're really going to up level. My commitment is to up level this podcast, and we're going to be changing the name from the Unbeatable Mind podcast to what I call the Fifth Plateau podcast. And we'll be talking a lot about that today with my guest, but that the fifth plateau is the level of awareness where, as a leader, you have world-centric care and concern and compassion. The decisions you make have a positive ripple effect locally in your community and also globally. And you and your team are committed to making a positive impact on the world beyond just making money or making a part or providing a service. And this mindset is an outcome of either natural evolution or training your mind. And that's something we're going to be talking about today. I'm with our esteemed guest. I'm very excited to talk to Leonard Perlmutter. Leonard Perlmutter is my guest today. Like I said, I'm excited to talk to Leonard because Leonard's a yogi. He's a founder and director of the American Meditation Institute. He's the originator of the National Conscious Month. As a meditation and yogi student, he studied under someone I'm well familiar with named Swami Rama. I can't wait to talk about Swami Rama, who came out of the Himalayas to the west and did a lot of good work, really validating the impact of meditation through scientific method. And Leonard has recently released a book called Your Conscience: The Key to Unlock Limitless Wisdom and Creativity and Solve All of Life's Challenges. That's a pretty bold claim, Leonard.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We all want to solve all of life's problems. And we know that we have to do it from the level of mind, right? Everything starts with mind.
Everything starts with mind, right? I can't even raise my hand without first entertaining a thought. Right. The mind moves first, the body follows. Consequences flow from that. That's right. The power is in the mind.
Absolutely. Well, I've said several times that yoga is the oldest mental development program in the world. And it's unfortunate that when most people's perception of yoga is stretchy, bendy, Lululemon yoga. And it's really not. It is the science of mental development and evolution. And, if you take the word spiritual and added in that, so mental and spiritual evolution, those kind of all come together into like one thing, right? Evolution is spiritual, it is mental. I can't wait. So give me a sense of how you got involved in this work. Like, what were some of the early influences and how did you meet up with Swami Rama? And take us back in time a little bit.
Okay. I would say that since my early childhood, two major principles have directed my life. The first is philosophical. I've always had a philosophical lens through which I see experiences. And the second principle is practicality. Mm-hmm. I'm a very practical person. If something that I learn does not have a practical application, then I don't give it too much energy. Mm-hmm. And so that led me in my early formative years in grade school and onto high school. I joined the Scouts. I was a Cub Scout and I was a Boy Scout. And it was an eye-opener. It was really very, very interesting to me because we learned practical tools for life and for survival. Mm-hmm. In fact, I had a conversation, this is interesting for me, had a conversation with my Scoutmaster years ago, and I said, the motto of Scouts is be prepared. So I said to him, and I asked him this question, Be prepared for what? And he looked at me with a strange look, and he says, "How would I know?" and
Be prepared for anything is what they meant, right?
that's right. That's right. So and I learned years ago, actually decades ago, from my auto mechanic, that if you have the right tool, every job is relatively easy.
Right.
So the mind is our most powerful tool. So that has motivated me to use the mind to be able to animate the body to bring about certain kinds of consequences that I desire, like happiness, like fulfillment, like security, like health.
Mm-hmm.
And that led me to reading all sorts of philosophical books, religious books, and eventually in 1976, I found out that Swami Rama of the Himalayas had a school in Pennsylvania where he sometimes spent the summer. So I wrote a note. This was well before internet, email. I wrote a note and they sent me a list of books. And I just started reading the books. And the first thing I said to my wife, my life's partner, since 1977 was, "Gee, this Swami Rama fella sounds like a scoutmaster." So that's the way he taught, in a very practical way. So I very honestly sort of began my own personal experimentation in what he was teaching. I had no intention and I had no desire to meet him. I just wanted to find out what the truth was and how to get to point B from point A.
Mm-hmm.
And so I practiced, I experimented. And as a consequence, I felt better. I felt better physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I became more creative in a variety of relationships. I had more energy, and it was a good deal.
Do you remember what some of the those early practices were? You know, what were you doing that led to those really beautiful results that you picked up from a book, might I add?
Yes. Well, the way Swami Rama taught was classical yoga science.
Right.
So the yoga science has different components. There is a philosophical component, a psychological component. The philosophical is about who am I?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this becomes the building block for everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the limitations of our brain and our senses, most human beings believe that they are the body, that
Right.
they are the mind, that they are their thoughts, that they are their desires, their personalities, their habit patterns. And even though we have a body, even though we have a mind, even though we have these thoughts, desires, and emotions with which we have relationships, we are not them. We are something other than that.
Mm-hmm.
We are this eternal consciousness, wisdom, bliss, and fullness, having this human experience through this mind-body sense complex.
Mm-hmm.
Now, by changing my perspective, I change my experience and I become more open to challenging faulty concepts that I had and still have
Mm-hmm.
on the software of my mind, in my unconscious mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that detachment
Yeah.
helped me to make better choices. So that philosophical component was first, then meditation, seated meditation,
Mm-hmm.
critically important,
Mm-hmm.
because that helps us to train the mind in a one-pointed manner, not multitasking, which we all know is impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to provide us the delusion that we multitask, what has to happen? Hormones, adrenaline has to surge through our entire physiology, and the effect of that is that it depresses the immune system, it depresses the mind, and we're really not as energetic and we're not as creative as if we were one-pointed.
Right.
So meditation trains that one-pointed attention. And through one-pointed attention, we automatically create a space between stimulus and response.
Right.
And what lies between stimulus and response? What lies in that space that the culture is invested heavily in annihilating? What's in the space between stimulus and response is our freedom, our freedom to redirect our attention toward the conscience, which alone can reflect super conscious wisdom from the center of consciousness. That's beyond the conscious, it's beyond the unconscious. Same portion of the mind where Albert Einstein saw mathematical equations. Same portion of the mind where Paul McCartney hears beautiful melodies. Doesn't mean I'm going to become a songwriter. Mark, it doesn't mean that you're going to become a physicist. But the more that we can focus our attention, create a space between stimulus and response, that provides us the freedom to check with our conscience. And the conscience can then reflect super conscious wisdom into our conscious mind that can become our thoughts, our words, and our actions that we are promised will always allow us to fulfill the purpose of our life without pain. And in the process, if I'm willing to commit to the experiment over and over again in different kinds of relationships, I'll be building the muscles of my willpower to do what's to be done, when it's to be done, and not to do what's not to be done, when it's not to be done.
Right. Wow, that's terrific. You covered a lot of territory there. First off, the term, you use the term conscious. Are you equating that with consciousness or awareness?
The conscious mind allows us to be conscious of something.
Right.
In other words, the unconscious, we don't have access to unless that which is stored in the unconscious mind travels into the conscious portion of the mind.
Right.
So when somebody cuts me off in traffic going 90 miles an hour in a 60-mile zone, and I have to slam on my brake in order to avoid an accident, a bubble of anger comes forward from my unconscious mind that I didn't even know was there. But in that instant, I am aware consciously of anger. Then the question becomes, in that moment when the unconscious has become conscious, what am I going to do with that energy? Anger is energy. It's contracted energy. It's debilitating, often poisonous. But I learned in 5th grade, energy, even though it cannot be created or destroyed, it can be transformed.
Right. No, I like that. So the way you're using the term conscious is really to be aware of awareness, aware of being aware.
Yes.
As opposed to like, you have use your conscious, which is more about your, act from your higher self or your ethical, moral self.
Well, it's beyond ethics. It's beyond morality.
It's beyond all that. That's right. So, but when people would commonly use that term conscious, like you consciously, or, you followed your conscience. It's really talking about morality. But what we're talking about is beyond morality, beyond any construct of the human brain.
Yes. And what's interesting is that the conscience, which is one of 4 functions of the mind, is the only decision maker.
Right.
Only the conscience, not the other 3 functions, not the ego, not the senses, not the unconscious. They're only advisors. They're counselors.
Right.
But only the conscience can discriminate, determine, judge, and decide. And when I learned that, it changed my life, because what it meant was every single choice that I have ever made, and every single choice I will make, has been and always will be made by the conscience that conscience is the only decision maker, but it can make two different kinds of decisions,
Right.
depending on how well behaved the other functions of the mind are.
Right. Right. And so you're saying that if you're contracted into believing in the identity of I am this body, I am these thoughts, generally speaking, you're playing out a script that's been fed you, right, or trained into you, right? And oftentimes, or not often, but in a large sense, you could say that script has manipulated us into that lack of freedom, lack of freedom of choice, because you are grabbing toward that which desire, because that's been programmed by the TV commercials and social media and all that. So when you train through meditation, your mind gets more and more still, and then can reach into or open up to the experience of non-dual awareness, or awareness awakening to itself. And then you said that then you can bring that, or that aspect of your being then kind of enters your conscious, and you make decisions from that perspective.
Exactly.
And in that space between reaction, which now becomes response, and I'm going to do this or that, is timeless. It's timeless, right? You can take all the time in the world, and it may only feel like an instant, but you have all this time in the world to ask, what's the highest and best thing? What does my conscious or spirit want me to do now? Right?
That's right. That's right.
I love that. And that decision is qualitatively different from your perspective. How you mentioned wisdom and access to information that you didn't normally have, but there's also other aspects to it, right? Like the empathetic or the heart, compassion. So what do decisions from that level of conscious awareness look, feel? How do they play out that are really different than the average or the common?
Well, they all uphold the fabric of the individual and of the whole organism,
right?
The whole organism. And so when I rely on the conscience to reflect superconscious wisdom, every thought, every word, every act is to be non-injurious.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because every relationship that I have is truly with myself. Even though you and I might have a different body, a different mind, a different personality, a different set of habit patterns, all of those change. They are changeable. And yet within each of us, there is something that is eternal. It is this ocean of consciousness. And within consciousness itself resides an intuitive library of wisdom, the superconscious portion of the mind. And in addition to that intuitive library of wisdom, the nature of consciousness is bliss and fullness, as opposed to lack, which arises when I believe that I am a limited human being, and everything else I can perceive through my brain and senses is an object, because that creates a space between me and all these other objects that I'm aware of. And in the space between the two, between the subject and the object, what lies between them is fear.
Right.
That I might lose something, or that I might not gain something. And fear always invites danger.
That's right. I think that's awesome, because the superconscious mind, or the aware mind, recognizes the sameness in all of us. Then this notion of not doing anything that's injurious to yourself extends to all beings.
That's right. And the opposite is true. If I am injurious to you, somewhere in space and time, something is going to come to me that is going to detract something.
That's right. That's beautiful. Let's go back to the philosophy. Ramana Maharshi, that was his, who am I was his primary meditation. So when you learned about the nature of reality and that question, you started to investigate that question, was it a practice for you, or were you just contemplating it as a philosopher?
Both.
Okay.
Both.
Can you describe?
Remember, I'm a practical guy.
That's right. Yeah.
So if it doesn't have a practical application, I don't give it much energy.
Well,
So it is both.
right. I get that. So let's describe maybe for the listener how they can use that as a practice of self-awareness, the who am I kind of study.
Sure. So again, when you change your perspective, you change your experience. Change your perspective, you change your experience. So if I have a relationship in front of me that's problematic, emotional, and I ask that question, who am I? That's a touchstone that brings me into my center. It's like viewing the earth from the far side of the moon. It changes your experience because you have changed your perspective. So you ask that question, it's a touchstone to your eternal, all-knowing self at the core of your being. So from that new perspective, I can become more detached in the situation. I can become more compassionate for the limitations not only of my own mind, but the limitations of the mind with whom I have a relationship. So I can learn in a practical way to set aside my own limitations, because I have limitations too. I have plenty of faulty concepts still stored in my unconscious mind that I got from my mother, my father, my grandmother, my grandfather, teachers, celebrities, politicians, whatever. But if I can change my perspective and I ask that question, who am I? Who am I? And the answer comes forth that you are essentially spirit having a human experience. I'm more detached. I'm more compassionate. I can set aside my own limitations that are in conflict with my inner wisdom. I can see the limitations that exist in the mind of the person with whom I have a relationship and set them aside. And if I am successful in that endeavor, the only thing that would exist between us is love, the most ancient traveler that travels from eternity to eternity. And it is the most powerful force, and it is the basis of all emotions.
Yeah, I love that. Love is, and everything less than love simply serves to block it at some level.
That's because anything else, you see, is ignorance. If I think I'm an individual, then I'm separate and I'm needy. And that love force changes into a desire for an object.
Right.
And if that desire is fulfilled, it brings about again another change of that love force into fear that I might lose what I have, or I fear I might not get what I want. But if that desire is blocked, it burns to anger. So desire, fear, and anger, those are the byproducts of not knowing who we are. And so that powerful love force becomes these powerful, contracted emotions. And they all spring forth from the four primitive fountains that affect all animals: for food, for sex, for sleep, and for self-preservation.
Yes. So Westerners are taught and it's passed on epigenetically to think that they're separate, to identify with the body and these desires, and to consumerism, to want and grasp for more. So it's a difficult leap for someone to just ask this question, who am I, and immediately get to the, I am spirit. I'm a spiritual being having this human existence, right? So there can be an iterative process, right, to start to examine what you think you are and then to disprove it, right? So you started to go through that earlier. Like, first start out with the obvious, like, I am this body and I am this personality called Mark, and I am this person with who was a Navy SEAL and who has these degrees. And you start to ask, is that really who I am? Right. And then the answer to that, when you ask it from from a quiet place is, no, that's not who I am. None of that really is. Those are the things I did. Those are, maybe I accrued some accomplishments along the way, but it's not who I am. And then, so then you start with the outer and the objective, and then you move into the subjective. Say, okay, well, am I these thoughts? No, maybe those thoughts were planted by my parents, like you said, or your grandparents. So you're not your thoughts. Like, am I my emotions? No, those are sensations in this body. Am I my body? No, you're not the body. There's something else going on, right? So you just kind of keep turning inward and turning inward and turning inward and turning inward until you disprove all of that.
But that all presupposes that I have a desire to engage in that kind of an inquiry.
That's right.
And that's a blessing, to be able to have that desire, even though it's a small desire. If you have that desire and you feed it, then you will receive what you need.
That's right. There's no turning back. I remember, I don't know if I read this from Yogananda or maybe Sri Rukaswar, but it said, they said it takes 1,000 lifetimes to find yoga, or the science of mental development.
Well, it takes a lot of different kinds of experiences to know both what to do and what not to do, because this human being, this is a challenging assignment, being a human being. It
is.
I tell you, this is what I have found.
Me as well. Funny, we have that in common. I think everyone listening would agree with that. It's a challenging assignment. And yoga really can set you free. And I love that. The freedom, it's like what Viktor Frankl said in Man's Search for Meaning. Ultimate freedom is choice, right? So you have the choice moment to moment to choose, love, to choose spirit, or to choose contraction and fear.
Right. And then whose life am I really living? I'm in service. I'm in servitude to these faulty concepts that I've just picked up along the way.
Yes.
Right. They're not even mine. They're just, renting space in my, on my hard drive, in my unconscious mind.
Right.
So I am not able to create the magnificent work of art that I have the capacity to create that's within me.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about Swami Rama, because he's a fascinating character. What you described, what we've been talking about, understanding who am I, and to constantly disprove who you're not, and to move toward who you are, the spiritual being. And then meditation, which is training, clarifying, purifying, and focusing the mind. Those are that's, takes you from grade school probably up through high school, maybe even college level, right? There's a lot of work to be done there. But the yogis of the East, the masters, they were well into the advanced degree territory when it came to mental development. And I remember reading, one of the things that was interesting about Swami Rama, when he came to the West, he wanted to have some demonstration of the unique, powerful skills that it can accrue to an advanced meditation practitioner. What Patanjali calls the siddhis, and he warns against the advanced siddhis, like being able to become as light as a feather so you could walk on water. Well, there's a famous individual who's well known for walking on water. Perhaps he was a yogi, right? But so he was a little bit more practical. Yeah, exactly. We won't go there in this one, but it's a strong likelihood. But Swami Rama was known to be able to produce a tumor on his arm with his mind and then make it disappear. Did you ever, what was your experience working with him directly, and how his mind worked, and some of these really fascinating things that he was able to do?
Well, he once told a story when he was young, before he was a Swami. He lived with his master in the cave monasteries of Rishikesh,
right,
in the foothills of the Himalayas. And he evidently had some kind of major disagreement with his guru, his teacher. And so the teacher came into the cave where they lived and saw that Swami Rama was packing up his belongings. Where are you going? Oh, I'm leaving. We're not getting along. I'm not learning anything from you. And the guru says to him, well, where are you going? Well, I'm going down the road. I'm going to go to this other cave of this great sage. and he's just marvelous. And he's going to teach me how to breathe fire. Oh, he's going to teach you how to breathe fire. That sounds very interesting. How long has he been practicing that to develop that technique, that city? And he says, whoa, it must be 20 or 25 years he's been working on it. And Bengali Baba, his guru, says to him, well, gee, if he wanted fire, why didn't he use a match?
I love it. Yeah. Why spend all that time to develop a skill when you could be doing something else with your mind?
Right.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
That will help serve your purpose, your purpose and that work of art.
Right. Well, in the case of Swami Rama, he must have known that the Westerners are very skeptical, right?
Mhm.
And they're very scientific materialism, and that if you can't measure it, it's not real. And so it was worth some time to develop the mind's ability to manifest a tumor, or to, I'm not sure what else he was able to do, but there's stories or legion of masters who could do these, incredible things. They'd be buried alive without access to breath, or even just a breatharian, right? As a yogi principle of being able to live on air.
Well, but what about when that guy cuts me off in traffic and I'm blinded with rage and anger? How about being able to transform that anger
into love,
into positive healing energy, an expansion of my willpower, and an increase in my creative possibilities?
100%.
Because I can do that. I can transform the power of fear or anger or selfish desire into energy, willpower, and creativity that becomes a strategic resource that I can call on in any relationship to fulfill it.
100%. And you could almost make the argument this day and age that type of sitting around and trying to practice learning how to breathe fire, or to read minds, or to walk on water is really self-serving, when the world could use your energy, that mental energy, for healing.
That's right. That's right. What is my contribution here?
Right.
And I don't even know the answer to that question, but the more that I become willing to serve this superconscious wisdom, the superconscious wisdom will guide this particular mind, body, sense complex to be in service to certain kinds of relationships. Mm-hmm. And that itself, by definition, will create the work of art.
That's right. The art of your human experience.
Yes.
Let's talk about karma, and Krishna and Arjuna on the battlefield, and that whole discussion about, hey, if you avoid your karma, then you'll bring suffering to yourself. And if you bring, of course, suffering to yourself, like we talked about, you're bringing suffering to the world. And yet, if your karma is something really crushingly hard, like going to battle and killing people, it's confusing for individuals. So, how can we penetrate this idea of karma and how that plays out in purpose in life?
Well, again, very practically. Mm-hmm. So, karma. Take a look at the law of karma. The law of karma states that thoughts lead to action, whether it's physical action, verbal, or mental, but thoughts lead to action, and action leads to consequences. Mm-hmm. So I'm a practical fellow, as I mentioned. So I start at the end. Mm-hmm. I look at the consequence that I want to experience, and then I work backwards at what's going to get me to point B from point A. Mm-hmm. So I need a business plan. I need a philosophy of life that is going to enable me to understand the law of karma, of thought, action, consequence, because I already know the consequence I want. I want to be happy. I want to be healthy. I want to be secure. I want loving, nurturing, creative relationships. Okay, how am I going to get to point B from point A? Mm-hmm. Well, if thoughts lead to action and action leads to consequence, the key is the thoughts. Mm-hmm. And every single thought is only a suggestion. It's not an imperial command. And yet every thought has energy that can either be used in the kinetic state, now in the present moment, or stored in the potential state for a different kind of relationship that requires it. And so when I can understand and respect that law of karma, of thought, action, consequence, sequence, then I can yoke myself to basing all of my actions, all of my thoughts and words on this super conscious wisdom reflected by the conscience. And the more that I do that, I find in my life that the consequence brings me happiness. It brings me security. It gives me meaning and purpose, and the body health, because there's a balance between outer action and inner wisdom, as opposed to conflict between outer action and inner wisdom. Because if there's conflict between outer action, thought, word, or deed, and inner superconscious wisdom, if there's a conflict in the mind, there has to be conflict outside the mind.
Right.
That could mean the body, or it could mean interpersonal relationships. But that inner conflict is the mother of all problems. So if I ameliorate that inner conflict and I sacrifice those habits that encourage the inner conflict, then I diminish the inner conflict and I also diminish the outer conflict.
Right. So that practice of awareness and being present and creating that space between the thought and the response to allow a response to come from higher consciousness or super consciousness precludes you from creating any more negative karma, negative consequences.
Let's be honest here. I get triggered just like every human being. There are some circumstances.
Let's say at the highest level, at the yogi.
There are certain circumstances where my wife taps me on the shoulder and says, "Hey, your father is speaking through your mouth."
I totally get that all the time. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So no matter how hard we work, there's always these vestiges that are going to always.
And Jesus is on the cross, right? We're talking about the Christ, this enlightened human being. He's on the cross. He's filled with fear and he's filled with anger, and he yells out, "Why have you forsaken me?"
Right.
And yet, as a yoga scientist, he catches himself, he examines it, he sacrifices it back to this supreme intelligence. It's transformed into energy, willpower, and creativity. And he's able to speak the words, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do."
Yeah. Wow, that's a really beautiful representation of that practice in action.
Yeah.
So what about this idea that karma follows us through lifetimes? And so like the net sum total of the positive and negative energies that you put out into the world and you imprint into the world as Leonard in this lifetime will help decide what kind of experiences you're going to have next time around.
Well, you're really talking about relationships, because there's no relationship that's an accident.
Right.
Every relationship is the consequence of a previous action, providing me the perfect opportunity to self-examine, let go of some obstacle, some faulty concept in my own mind, so that the love force can come through me in a clearer, more meaningful, and productive way.
That's beautiful. I love it. Your book, Your Conscience, The Key to Unlock Limitless Wisdom and Creativity and Solve All of Life's Challenges. Let's talk a little bit about that. I know we're running a little short on time, so we've got a few more minutes, but I'd love to know kind of what inspired it and like we've been talking, of course, about the message, but let's get a little bit more specific about the book.
Well, I found myself in February of 2020 in quarantine because of the COVID. I was not teaching classes here at the American Meditation Institute. And I started asking myself, how am I to be of service? What type of action can I take that can be of service? And like most people, I was watching the news. I was listening to things on the internet and in newspapers, and I saw all this pain that was going on, all this pain, and my heart ached. What can I do? What can I give people? I have to give people a gift that's practical, that will help them as a tool to make conscious, discriminating choices that will enable them to become self-reliant and self-confident in their own self and their own decision-making process. And so I thought that the best thing I could do was to give them an understanding of their conscience and the four functions of the mind that need to be coordinated so that the conscience can reflect superconscious wisdom, as opposed to just becoming a rubber stamp of the limited, faulty concepts of ego, senses, and or unconscious mind.
I love it. So conscious mind, we've talked a lot about that. How do you define ego as an aspect of mind?
My friend, the ego. First of all, I have to say that the ego's not always wrong.
Right.
So you and I both, Mark, need a healthy ego right now to have this conversation, or to drive an automobile or a truck. We need a healthy ego to keep us alive.
Right.
But the ego, there's a downside to it because it has such a narrow perspective. It seems to me that the ego is hardwired to the reptilian brain. And the reptilian brain is heavily invested in self-preservation.
That's right.
You know, I don't want to die. I don't want to lose the form. So in service to that desire, which engenders a tremendous amount of fear of annihilation, the ego insinuates itself in every relationship and cuts that relationship in half and says, oh, over here, this portion is pleasant. I like it. I consider this good. Let's reprise it. On the other hand, over here, this portion of this relationship, this is unpleasant. I don't like it. I think this is bad. I want to eliminate this. So what happens is we become addicted to the limited perspectives of the ego because the ego is so loud and so pushy and so insistent. And so that noise in the mind creates an addiction to going after likes and avoiding dislikes. But our practical everyday experience has already taught us that that which appears as pleasant isn't always good for us. Right. And that which is unpleasant isn't always bad for us. But if I'm locked into that limited perspective, then whose life am I living? So I have to provide for the ego a pleasant experience where he gives up or she gives up that limited perspective just for the sake of an experiment, like brushing your teeth. The ego first thing is going to say, I don't want to do it. I vote against it. Of course, because to the ego, it seems like I'm going to be missing out on something that potentially could be really enjoyable. But if I could teach the ego to take a 2-minute time out to brush the teeth, I believe, because I have experienced this with the ego, that the ego will say, hey, it wasn't so bad. And I didn't die by embracing some form of change that I thought previously would have annihilated me.
Right. It's fascinating. As you're talking, what's coming up is just how social media and the technologies of today are really training the ego to be dominant.
Yes.
It's always grasping, always triggering, and always getting pleasure out of, the next stimulus, the next hit.
That's because the culture that we have is not a philosophical culture.
Right.
It is a commercial culture.
Transactional, right?
Yes, it's transactional.
Terrific. So the way out is asking the question, who am I?
The way out is the way in.
The way out is the way in. You're turning. Yeah. You got to go in to get out. I love that.
That's right.
You got to go
And
in.
that's it. That's the balance. That's yoga.
That's
right. It's all about balance of inner wisdom and outer action. So before we commit our assets in mind, action, and speech, counsel within.
That's right.
Find the wisdom within you, and then take that wisdom and bring it into the world.
Beautiful. Where can people learn more about you, Leonard? Do you have a website or?
Yes, we have two websites. One for the book called yourconscience.org, yourconscience.org.
Good.
And in 1996, I founded the American Meditation Institute. Swami Rama had sent me a note from India, and it was just a 3-word note, and he said, "Start teaching now." Okay.
Okay.
What, where, how? None of those were illuminated at all. And the only thing that I felt qualified as a Westerner, an American who did not grow up with this teaching, the only thing I felt empowered to teach was what I practiced.
Right.
And I didn't want any association with anything foreign. So I came up with the best American kind of a name. So I called it the American Meditation Institute.
Perfect.
In 1996. And people can see what we offer. We have a foundation course there, which will speak to all of these issues that we've had conversation about today. And that website is americanmeditation.org.
American Meditation Institute at americanmeditation.org. And the book is found at yourconsciousness.com.
No, your conscience.
Your conscience. CONSCIENCE. Your conscience.
In Latin, conscience means with science.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that's fascinating. So yourconscience.org. And there's a reason to buy it there or to go learn about it there versus, let's say, on Amazon?
No, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any place that's convenient for folks.
Yeah, sometimes if you buy it at a website, the individual who wrote it offers some kind of free course or bonus. I just wanted to ask that.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, Leonard, first off, thank you for your life's work.
Well, thank you for your life's work.
I appreciate that. And thank you for bringing the gift of this book.
That brought us this karma, hey?
It brought us this karma to have this conversation. And
That's
it was very, very enjoyable, very stimulating. My mind is seeing so many connections and it's so needed in this world, right? So the Westerns, I feel like our culture, the deck's stacked against us, the cards are stacked against us because of the just inundation of information and constant distraction and consumerism. And so people need to fight back, and this is the way to fight back. You don't fight back through negative action by fighting what you're against. That just creates more negative energy and injures
Fight
yourself.
against the darkness, against the ignorance.
Right. You bring light. The way to fight darkness is to bring more light into the world. And
darkness cannot exist when there's the presence of light.
That's correct. And so we have to be the light, and we have to let the light in and through us, and through your practices that you've described and in your book are one extraordinarily valid way to do that. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate your time.
An honor and a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, folks. So that is a wrap. We have Leonard Perlmutter at the, go check them out at yourconscience.org or the americanmeditation.org. That's the American Meditation Institute. Get the book, read it, share it, and practice both the philosophy and the practical side of it. So
can I just say one last thing?
Please do. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say to people that have been listening, I don't want you to believe a word I have said. What I would like you to, if you're interested at all, is experiment with it for yourself. Put on your doubting Thomas hat, experiment with it, and see what you experience. Only then will you experience the truth. And only then will you become self-reliant and not reliant on me or any other outside source.
100%. Yeah, we're seeking autonomy and freedom, and that has to be found within.
Right.
Awesome. Thank you again, Leonard.
Pleasure.
It's been an honor.
God bless you.
God bless you. All right, folks, that's a wrap. This is Mark Devine with the Fifth Plateau Podcast, formerly the Unbeatable Mind Podcast. And once again, I really appreciate your time and attention and for doing the work to make yourself and the world a better place. And on that note, hoo-yah, see you next time. Devine out.